So I'm reading this great new book. It's called The World is What It Is, the authorized biography of V.S. Naipaul, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2001. Now, I love reading the biographies of great writers. It's not just because their lives inspire me, but I find great comfort in these books because I find that all my weaknesses, all my flaws, all my moral and psychological shortcomings, all the great writers have similar problems. So I'm not alone, and anything that makes me feel that I'm not alone in the world is a good thing. So I identify with Naipaul in many ways. Yes, I've never published a novel, but aside from those minor details, Naipaul stands for high civilization, individual rights, and the rule of law. And like Naipaul, I've made malign jokes about people with darker skin than myself, and I've blamed formerly oppressed nations for their continuing failure. So, the author writes that he noticed that when Naipaul was being particularly rude or provocative, he was full of glee. Creating tension, insulting his friends, family, or whole communities left him in excellent spirits. So I identify with that. It's a kind of a Trinidadian trait. It's being piquant, meaning sharp or cutting, where the boundary between good and bad taste is deliberately blurred and the listener sent reeling. I often say outrageous things, but I think like Naipaul, I often do it just to start conversations, not to end them. I usually don't say outrageous things to people I don't care to talk to. I say outrageous things to get a conversation going, to liven things up, to talk about a little jungle fever or yellow fever. I love how Naipaul's dad wrote someone about V.S. Naipaul. You know at heart he's not a bad fellow, only a bit erratic and thoughtless and callously unconventional. I identify with this description of Servidea at Oxford. He was overdeveloped and underdeveloped all at the same time, intellectually advanced and emotionally restricted, alone in an alien world. Vidya wrote a friend from Oxford, "Feeling of emptiness is nearly always on me. I see myself struggling in a sort of tunnel, blocked up at both ends." A girl broke up with Vidya when he was at Oxford, telling him he was too forceful and intense. Boy, have I heard that description throughout my life. I love Servidea's description of prayer as incense for the incensed God. Now, the Weekly Standard wrote in its review of this book, during a brief remission in his wife's cancer, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist V.S. Naipaul casually explained to a journalist that he had always been a great prostitute man, mongering among the whores from the early days of his marriage. The publicity that followed from the remark consumed his wife, he later admitted to his biographer. She had all the relapses and everything after that she suffered. It could be said that I killed her. I feel a little bit that way. Unfortunately, he didn't feel that way enough to think it inappropriate to move into his house the day after he cremated his wife, his new mistress, a Pakistani journalist he'd just met and would in short order marry. Even before the whoring revelations, Naipaul's first wife, a middle-class woman named Patricia Hale, whom he'd met while a student on scholarship to England, had known about a prior mistress, but only because Naipaul himself decided one day to tell her, explaining the violent acts he enjoyed with the woman, some of them memorialized in photographs he brought along to aid the explanation. The woman's name was Margaret Gooding, and Naipaul met her in 1972 in Buenos Aires. French's new biography of Naipaul, The World is What It Is, quotes extensively from her letters, unbearable scrawls that read like clinical case studies drawn from the pages of Leopold von Seecke-Masoch. She begs, moans, despairs, and pleads for Naipaul's cruel sexual desires. She calls him her god, her black master. Her multiple abortions of his children sicken her, but she offers them up to him as proof of her love and abasement. And all this sex stuff is only the beginning. Throughout The World is What It Is, Naipaul shows himself arrogant beyond belief and vile-tempered, and as self-obsessed as a man simpering while he looks at himself in the mirror. His letters and conversation are full of references to niggers and dismissals of Africans and dark-skinned Indians. The man was capable of extraordinary cruelty. Unhappy with Margaret at one point, Naipaul explains, "I was very violent with her for 2 days. Her face was bad. She couldn't appear really in public. My hand was swollen." But then he was capable of ordinary, everyday cruelty as well. "You are the only woman I know who has no skill." His wife's diaries reveal Naipaul once told her just in passing, "You behave like the wife of a clerk who has risen above her station." He moved on to the mistress who would become his second wife because Margaret had simply grown unworthy of his use, middle-aged, almost an old lady. Okay, so does this make Naipaul a horrible man? If a woman such as Margaret chooses to stay as his mistress for 24 years, chooses to stay in an abusive relationship, is it abuse or is it a consensual sadomasochistic relationship? Like, if he liked to beat her and she liked to be beaten, should we condemn Naipaul for that? Should we condemn her for that? She chose to stay in a sadomasochistic relationship. It was consensual between adults. What's so evil? I must be a bad man because I do not see any of these revelations about Servidea as so horrible. I can only assume that Pat and Margaret chose to stay with Servidea because the rewards they got from being around this great writer outweighed the price they paid. Many of the cruelest things ever said to me were by a writer friend who was also every bit as generous and kind as he was cruel. When he ended our friendship, I was the poorer, and I missed him terribly. Paul Theroux writes in The Times of London, "Now French's biography amply demonstrates everything I said and more." Paul Theroux wrote a book about Servidea caught in Servidea's shadow. "It is not a pretty story. It will probably destroy Naipaul's reputation forever. This chronicle of his pretensions, his whoremongering, his treatment of a sad, sick wife and disposable mistress, his evasions, his meanness, his cruelty amounting to sadism, his race-baiting. Then there is the gruesome sex, the blame-shifting, the paranoia, the disloyalty, the nasty cracks, and the whining, the ingratitude, the mood swings, the unloving and destructive personality." I must be a bad man because I don't see any of those things as horrible. Okay, so Naipaul had pretensions. Which one of us do not? Almost all writers have pretensions. All artists have pretensions. It's the pretense that sustains you when the cruel world out there is not receptive to your work. Condemn him for his whoremongering? He purchased the services of women who willfully gave them in exchange for money. We're to condemn him as a bad man for this? His treatment of a sad, sick wife and disposable mistress? Well, what are you supposed to do with a mistress? A mistress, by almost definition, is disposable. She chose to consensually stay with him for 24 years, and then he ended this consensual relationship between adults. I don't see that as so horrible. Yes, his treatment of his wife is horrible, but she chose to stay with a person who she knew had horrible aspects to his person. So she chose to be married to him for 25, 30 years. She knew the man that she'd thrown in her lot with. So she made that decision. So why should we condemn him when she chose to stay with him? His race baiting. Why isn't it just funny? Why is it evil? Gruesome sex. Sex between consenting adults. How could that be gruesome? The blame shifting. Which one of us does not? Everybody engages in blame shifting. The paranoia. A lot of people are paranoid. The disloyalty. Who among us has never been disloyal? The nasty cracks. Who among us who is clever with words doesn't make a nasty crack? The whining. Who among us doesn't whine? The ingratitude. Who among us is not ungrateful? The mood swings. Which artist does not have mood swings? The unloving and destructive personality. All of us are unloving and destructive at times. Why should we castigate this man for visiting prostitutes? What is so evil about that? If his mistress consents to him beating her, what's so terrible? If his wife chooses to stay with him despite his patronizing of hookers and his keeping of a mistress and other sins, why should we condemn him for this? His race baiting, as I mentioned, strikes me as comic. I don't know. It just reminds me, I used to cover the porn industry for many years, and often directors and producers in the porn industry would be condemned for having sex with the porn stars. Well, what else are you supposed to do with a porn star but have sex with her? You're supposed to sit around and talk Shakespeare with her? The whole point of sex workers and sluts is to have your fun and move on. It's not holy, it's not the Jewish way, it's not the Christian way, I assume it's not the Hindu or Muslim way either. But that's what you do with sex workers and sluts. That's kind of what makes them sex workers and sluts, because they consent to being used sexually.